These are the roughly 1,000 chapters of the Adeptus Astartes, and almost none of them fight the same war the same way. When people say Space Marine, they usually mean one thing, a giant in ceramite armor with a bolter. But that single image is doing an enormous amount of flattening. A chapter is not a uniform unit copied 1,000 times. It is closer to a nation, a monastery, and a special forces command all fused into one, and the differences between them are not cosmetic. They are doctrinal, organizational, and in some cases they are the entire reason a chapter still exists at all. This dossier pulls up chapter after chapter the way a strategic command terminal would. Heraldry, Doctrine, Homeworld, notable campaigns, and, where it matters, the genocide status flagged honestly, because not every chapter's gene seed record is clean, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest to the source material. Let's start where the whole system starts. After the Horus heresy, the Adeptus Astartes had a structural problem. Full-strength Space Marine legions, tens of thousands of superhuman warriors under a single Primarch's personal command, had just proven they could turn on the Imperium itself. Roughly half of them did. The Codex Astartes, attributed within the fiction to the Ultramarines Primarch Guilliman, and formalized in the Codex Astartes source material used across multiple editions of Warhammer 40,000 rulebooks since the 1990s, restructured the remaining loyalist legions into smaller chapters, capped at roughly 1,000 battle brothers each, organized into 10 companies with standardized roles, tactical, assault, devastator, plus specialist 1st Company veterans and 10th Company scouts. This is called the Second Founding. It is the single most consequential organizational decision in the setting's history, because it's the reason there isn't one Space Marine army. There are roughly 1,000 small ones, deliberately kept small, deliberately kept doctrinally isolated from each other, so that no single commander could ever again hold the kind of concentrated, loyalty-dependent power a Primarch held over an entire legion. Some chapters accepted this restructuring completely, others accepted it on paper and quietly kept operating closer to their old legion doctrine. A few never accepted it at all. That tension, compliance versus divergence, is the organizing spine of this entire video. Before the Second Founding split everything apart, there were the original Space Marine legions raised directly under the Emperor, each eventually led by a Primarch. Of the Loyalist legions, several first founding chapters kept their legion's original name, and in practice, a great deal of their original identity, because they were the rootstock the Codex reorganization was built from. The Ultramarines are the reference case, not because they're the most powerful in raw lore terms, but because they're the chapter the entire Codex system is modeled on. Homeworld Macrag, doctrine built around combined arms flexibility and strict adherence to the Codex Astartes, and a campaign record spanning literally 10,000 years of Imperial history as presented across Games Workshop's core rulebooks and Ultramarines-focused source material. The Dark Angels are the opposite case, and this is where the dashboard has to flag something honestly. The Dark Angels never fully complied with the Second Founding spirit. They kept their internal structure closer to a legion, a supreme Grand Master, an inner circle called the Death Wing, and a standing secret, the Hunt for the Fallen, loyalist-turned-traitor Dark Angels from the Horus Heresy era who are still, according to the fiction, being tracked down and either redeemed or executed in secret, 10 millennia later. That's not a minor lore footnote. It's a chapter that has spent 10,000 years running what amounts to a parallel, undisclosed military operation the wider Imperium doesn't fully know about. The Blood Angels carry a different, heavier weight, the Red Thirst and the Black Rage, a hereditary psychological and physiological condition tracing back to the death of their Primarch Sanguinius at the climax of the Horus Heresy. A percentage of Blood Angels and their many successor chapters eventually succumb to a berserk psychosis that ends in either death in battle or internment among the chapter's death company. This is presented in the fiction as an accepted, planned-for cost of being that gene line, not a bug the chapter hides, but a tragedy it has built entire company structures around managing. The Space Wolves are the clearest case of a chapter that simply never restructured to the Codex at all. Homeworld Fenris, organized into great companies under individual wolf lords, rather than the standard 10-company Codex structure, and openly, canonically non-compliant, a status the wider Imperium tolerates specifically because of the Space Wolves' close historical relationship with the Emperor and their sheer battlefield effectiveness. If a smaller, newer chapter tried the same non-compliance, the outcome in the fiction is generally treated very differently. This is where the numbers actually explode. The second founding didn't just reorganize the surviving legions, it split several of them into multiple entirely new chapters, each given a new name, new heraldry, and often a new homeworld, but tracing gene seed lineage back to a single Primarch's genetic stock. The Ultramarines alone spawned an enormous number of successor chapters across the second founding and subsequent foundings, commonly cited across Games Workshop's Ultramarines and Codex Astartes source material as roughly 20 direct second founding successors, with the total lineage, counting later foundings, running into the hundreds of chapters sharing Ultramarines' gene seed. The Imperial Fists produced their own successor line, including chapters built specifically around siege warfare and static defense doctrine, reflecting the Imperial Fists' own specialization. The White Scars, Iron Hands, Salamanders and Raven Guard also produced successor lines, each one inheriting not just gene seed but a doctrinal starting point their Primarch had established. Here's the part worth sitting with. Two chapters can share the exact same gene seed lineage, genetically almost identical Space Marines, and still fight completely differently, because doctrine, homeworld culture, and centuries of independent campaign history diverge them. Gene seed tells you what a Space Marine's body can do. It tells you almost nothing about how his chapter actually fights. Pull 2 more dossiers before moving on, because they sharpen the pattern rather than repeat it. The Salamanders, Homeworld Nocturne, are built around a doctrine that is almost the philosophical opposite of a chapter like the Flesh Tearers, a deep, culturally embedded emphasis on protecting civilian populations, close integration with their homeworld's population through a mentorship and return tradition where Salamanders serve their people directly, and a reputation across Games Workshop's Salamanders source material for restraint and compassion that is treated in fiction as a genuine tactical liability at times. A chapter that will take losses to save civilians other chapters would write off as acceptable collateral. The Iron Hands sit at the other extreme, doctrine built around the belief that flesh is inherently weak and machine is inherently strong, extensive voluntary cybernetic replacement of organic body parts among their battle brothers, and a command culture that, per Games Workshop's Iron Hands source material, treats compassion and mercy as doctrinal failure states rather than virtues. 2 first founding lineages, same baseline codex structure on paper, and in practice almost nothing about how they value a human life in the field is the same. This is a place this dashboard has to flag honestly rather than paper over. The Cursed Founding, sometimes referenced in Games Workshop source material as a founding whose chapters suffered disproportionate gene seed instability and organizational failure, is thin on hard, consistently sourced detail across editions. The fiction treats it more as an ominous historical footnote than a fully catalogued event, and specific casualty or chapter count figures for it are not something this dashboard is going to invent. Later foundings, the various piecemeal, smaller-scale foundings that have continued sporadically across Imperial history, are even less centrally documented. Individual chapters get individual sourcebooks, but there isn't a single authoritative master ledger of founding number, date, chapter count, the way there is for the well-documented first and second foundings. Where a specific date or number isn't reliably sourced across editions, this dashboard is treating it as unknown rather than guessing. Beyond the Space Wolves' open non-compliance, several other chapters diverged from standard codex structure in ways that generated real consequences within the fiction. The Black Templars operate without a fixed homeworld at all, a fully void-based chapter, organized around crusades rather than static company deployment, and built around a doctrine of unrelenting religious zealotry against anything non-human, closer to a militant monastic order than a standing army. The Flesh Tearers, a Blood Angel's successor, are presented in later Games Workshop source material as having a significantly worse relationship with the Black Rage than their parent chapter, a chapter whose reputation for brutal, uncontrolled violence against enemies is treated in fiction as, at minimum, an open concern for the wider Imperium. And then there's a case worth naming directly because it's the sharpest illustration of what happens when the Imperium decides a chapter's divergence has gone too far. the Firehawks and the broader fallout of the Badab War, a chapter versus chapter civil conflict depicted in Games Workshop's Badab War source material, where several chapters that had drifted into open non-compliance and in some cases outright secession were brought to heel by an Imperial-sanctioned military response from loyalist chapters. Some rebel chapters were destroyed outright, others were forcibly reabsorbed or reduced to remnants. It's one of the only points in the modern-era fiction where Space Marine chapter turns on Space Marine chapter isn't a Heresy-era historical event, it's a comparatively recent, large-scale internal war. Before the size variance panel, it's worth pulling up a sorting view, because chapter covers at least 4 structurally different operating models across the source material. First, standard Codex-compliant chapters, fixed Homeworld or Fortress Monastery, 10 companies, the Ultramarines template. Second, fleet-based chapters with no fixed Homeworld at all, operating from a chapter fleet permanently. The Black Templars fall here, and so do several smaller chapters whose sourcebooks describe them as void born by necessity rather than by choice, after losing a Homeworld. Third, culturally divergent but structurally Codex-adjacent chapters, the Space Wolves' Great Company system and the Dark Angels' Inner Circle structure both keep a recognizable company-scale organization while diverging hard on command hierarchy and internal secrecy. Fourth, successor chapters that inherited not just gene seed, but an entire regional or homeworld-specific mission. Several Ultramarine successors, for instance, are documented across Games Workshop's Ultramarine source material as holding specific subsectors of Imperial space as a standing, generational assignment rather than a rotating deployment. 4 structurally different models, all filed under the same word. Pull this panel up on its own, because the numbers matter more than they usually get credit for. A textbook Codex-compliant chapter caps at roughly 1,000 battle brothers across 10 companies. That's the number people picture when they hear chapter. But that number is a target strength, not a guaranteed one. Chapters recovering from heavy losses, the Firehawks after Badab, for instance, can be reduced to a few hundred effectives or fewer, operating at a fraction of intended strength for years or decades while the fiction treats their genetic stock and recruitment pipeline as the real bottleneck to rebuilding, not simple manpower. Meanwhile, a non-compliant chapter like the Space Wolves, organized into great companies rather than 10 fixed companies, doesn't map cleanly onto the 1,000-brother figure at all. Its structure was never built around that number in the first place. So when this dashboard says roughly 1,000 chapters, understand that it's describing 1,000 different organizations operating at wildly different fractions of a nominal size that many of them were never actually built to hit in the first place. One more panel worth pulling before the reaction segment, because it explains a lot of the variance already on screen. Recruitment practice across Games Workshop's Codex Astartes and individual chapter source material is overwhelmingly local. A chapter recruits from its own homeworld population or from a small set of tithed worlds, generation after generation. That single structural choice is arguably the biggest doctrine engine in the entire system, bigger than gene seed lineage. Fenris produces Space Wolves, whose pre-Astartes culture is already built around personal bravery, clan loyalty, and a frontier survival ethic that maps almost directly onto Great Company structure. Doctrine produces Salamanders, whose pre-Astartes culture already prizes craftsmanship and communal protection, because Doctrine itself is a volcanic death world, where surviving as a community is the baseline condition of life. A chapter's doctrine, in other words, usually isn't handed down from on high by the Codex alone. It's the Codex structure filtered through whatever culture the recruits already carried in before implantation. 2 chapters with identical gene seed, recruiting from 2 culturally opposite homeworlds, will diverge in temperament even before Doctrine officially enters the picture. That's not the Codex failing to standardize the chapters. It's the Codex never having tried to standardize the one variable, homeworld culture, that turns out to matter most. There's a second-order effect worth flagging here too. When a chapter loses its homeworld, or when a fleet-based chapter never had one, the doctrine-shaping mechanism homeworld culture usually provides has to come from somewhere else, often from a founding trauma instead, the way Istvan V shaped the Raven Guard, or from an institutional ideology instead, the way the Black Templars' crusading doctrine substitutes for a homeworld's cultural gravity entirely. Chapters without a homeworld aren't doctrinally blank. They just get their doctrine engine from a different source, and it tends to show up as something sharper and more singular than a homeworld-rooted chapter's more gradually blended culture. Here's what actually gets me, sitting with all these dossiers side by side. When I started pulling this together, I expected Space Marine chapter to be a category with maybe a dozen meaningfully different flavors: loyalist, zealot, savage, whatever. What I didn't expect was how much genuine doctrinal and organizational diversity gets erased the moment someone says the word Space Marines as a single noun. A Black Templar and an Ultramarine are, on paper, the same baseline creation, same Codex Astartes lineage, similar implant process, and in practice they are almost unrecognizable as the same kind of organization. One has a fixed homeworld, a company structure, and a doctrine built on flexibility. The other has no homeworld at all, no fixed companies, and a doctrine built on religious annihilation. Calling both of them Space Marines, and stopping there isn't wrong, exactly. It's just doing so much flattening that it stops being useful as a description. That's not a complaint about the setting. Games Workshop clearly built the Variance in on purpose. It's more that most casual coverage of this faction, including a lot of what's out there already, treats Space Marine lore as basically one flavor with different paint jobs, when the actual source material treats the differences as load-bearing. Sitting with that discomfort a bit longer, because it changes how the rest of this dossier should be read. If Space Marines flattens 1,000 distinct organizations into one label, then every ranking video, every tier list, every which chapter is strongest comparison, including plenty this channel could easily make, is quietly making a category error before it even starts. You can't meaningfully rank the Black Templars against the Iron Hands on a single power axis, because they're not optimized for the same thing. A Black Templar chapter measures itself by zealous, void-based crusading endurance. An Iron Hands chapter measures itself by mechanical self-sufficiency and battlefield attrition tolerance. Neither ranking axis is wrong. They're just answering different questions, and collapsing them into one leaderboard erases the exact organizational texture that makes each chapter's dossier worth pulling up individually in the first place. That's the actual argument this video is making, underneath the terminal aesthetic. The diversity isn't trivia, it's the point. A few dossier entries worth pulling individually for their campaign records, sourced to Games Workshop's major campaign books across editions, the Imperial Fists' defense of their fortress monastery phalanx, and their long institutional memory of the Iron Cage, the humiliation of their Primarch Dawn's forces during the Horus Heresy Siege of Terror, still shapes Imperial Fists' successor doctrine towards siege and static defense specialization. The White Scar's emphasis on high-speed bike and land speeder deployment, hit-and-run doctrine inherited from their Primarch Jagatai Khan, marks them out sharply from the slower, more static doctrine of Imperial Fist successors. The Raven Guard's doctrine of stealth, infiltration, and small unit deployment traces directly back to their depleted numbers after the Horus Heresy's Istvan Vav drop site massacre, where the Raven Guard suffered catastrophic losses, a historical trauma that, per Games Workshop's Horus Heresy source material, directly shaped how the chapter and its successors fight to this day, never in the open, never at full strength, always in the shadows. A few more entries earn their panel here. The Crimson Fists, an Imperial Fist successor, are documented across Games Workshop's Rin's World source material as having been reduced to a small fraction of their original strength, defending their homeworld against an Orc invasion, a chapter that survived catastrophic losses and, per that same source material, spent a significant span of subsequent years rebuilding from a fraction of nominal chapter strength, a real-world illustration of the size variance panel earlier in this dossier rather than an abstract number. The Black Dragons, referenced in Games Workshop source material addressing chapters with documented gene seed and psychological instability, are flagged in fiction as a chapter whose battle brothers have exhibited violent, cannibalistic mutation symptoms tied to their gene seed line, a case this dashboard is marking unknown/disputed on long-term outcome, since the chapter's ultimate fate across different source material isn't consistently resolved. The Marines Malevolent, referenced primarily through secondary Codex-era Games Workshop material and White Dwarf coverage, are treated in fiction as a chapter whose brutal, morale-punitive command culture toward its own Imperial Guard allies has made it a byword for chapters whose methods, even by Imperial standards, provoke discomfort, worth naming because not every divergence from Codex ideals in this setting is framed sympathetically, and this dashboard isn't going to sand that down. One recurring readout on this terminal is a simple flag, stable, flawed, or unknown, next to a chapter's gene seed status. This isn't decorative. Games Workshop's source material treats gene seed stability as one of the most consequential and most guarded pieces of information a chapter has, because a flawed gene seed line, prone to mutation, organ rejection, or psychological instability, can be an existential threat to a chapter's ability to keep recruiting viable battle brothers at all. Some chapters, including several successor lines descended from Primarchs whose original gene seed carried inherent flaws, have spent centuries managing degradation quietly, rather than risk the stigma, and in some cases outright dissolution, that an official flawed designation could trigger from the wider Adeptus Terra. Where this dashboard doesn't have a reliably sourced status across editions for a given chapter, it says unknown, rather than guessing, because inventing a purity status for a chapter the source material leaves ambiguous would be exactly the kind of fabrication this series avoids. Close the terminal out on the actual editorial point, because it's not just trivia. If you're trying to understand the Imperium of Man as a functioning setting, Space Marines is not a unit type. It's closer to a genus with roughly 1,000 distinct species inside it, each shaped by 3 forces layered on top of each other. Which Primarch's gene seed it carries, how strictly or loosely it complied with the Second Founding's restructuring, and what specific historical trauma or homeworld culture bent its doctrine away from the Codex baseline. 2 chapters can share gene seed and fight nothing alike. 2 chapters can have wildly different gene seed and converge on similar doctrine by historical accident. The Codex Astartes was supposed to standardize all of this after the heresy. 10,000 years later, in the fiction's own telling, it mostly succeeded at preventing another War Master, and mostly failed at making the chapters uniform. That gap between the intended structure and the actual, wildly divergent reality is, honestly, the more interesting story than any single chapter's individual campaign record. Last panel, and it's the one that puts everything in this dossier into real perspective. A single Codex-compliant Space Marine chapter at full nominal strength is roughly 1,000 battle brothers. A single Astra Militarum, Imperial Guard, Regiment, per Games Workshop's Astra Militarum source material across editions, commonly fields anywhere from several hundred to several thousand personnel depending on regiment type, with many standard infantry regiments alone matching or exceeding a full chapter's total headcount before support and armor elements are even counted. In raw numbers, one chapter is often smaller than a single regiment. What a chapter brings instead is doctrine flexibility, individual lethality, and deployment speed that no equivalent headcount guard formation can match. 1,000 genetically enhanced, power-armored specialists against thousands of baseline humans with lasguns. Neither force replaces the other in Imperial military doctrine. The fiction consistently treats chapters as a scalpel, and guard regiments as the actual mass that holds territory. The elite over numbers framing gets repeated so often it stops sounding like a real trade-off. It is one. A chapter that loses a company in a single battle has lost roughly 1/10 of its entire fighting strength for potentially decades. A regiment that loses a company has lost a fraction of a much larger, more replaceable whole. That asymmetry is the real cost of what elite means in this setting, and it's worth sitting with rather than just repeating as a cool fact. One last flag before this terminal closes out. A dossier format like this one is good at showing discrete units side by side. Chapter, Homeworld, Doctrine, Campaign, done. It's genuinely bad at showing the things that don't sit cleanly inside one chapter's box. The way Inquisition oversight of certain chapters varies enormously and mostly happens off the record. The way chapter master succession crises have occasionally split loyalist chapters from the inside without ever escalating to a Badab-scale war, or the way some of the newest, smallest foundings barely have enough campaign history for a dossier at all yet. A format built around clean panels risks implying every chapter is equally documented, equally stable, equally legible to Imperial command. They're not. Some of the 1,000 chapters out there are, by the setting's own internal logic, barely known even to each other. This has been a dossier pull on the Adeptus Astartes chapter system, first founding through the present, codex-compliant and openly divergent alike, sourced to Games Workshop's core rulebooks, Codex Astartes material, Horus Heresy series sourcebooks, and the Badab War campaign books across editions, with the genuinely thin or undocumented gaps in the founding record flagged rather than filled in. This dossier deliberately left several threads open rather than force a false completeness onto them: the exact founding count ledger, the long-term fate of certain gene seed compromised chapters, the internal politics of inquisitorial oversight, because a command terminal that claims total knowledge of 1,000 independent, often secretive organizations would be lying to you, and that's not what this dashboard is for. Terminal cycling complete.